The morning sun cast a golden glow over London as thousands of people lined the streets, their faces filled with excitement and anticipation. Westminster Abbey stood majestically in the distance, its ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of royal history. Today would be another chapter in that grand story, and the crowds had been waiting for hours just to catch a glimpse of the royal family. Inside Kensington Palace, Princess Kate stood before a large mirror, her reflection showing a woman who had grown from a nervous bride into a confident future queen. Her stylist made final adjustments to her elegant ivory gown, which had been designed specifically for this historic occasion. The dress featured delicate embroidery that told stories of British heritage, with roses, thistles, and daffodils woven into the fabric. Kate's hands trembled slightly as she touched the sapphire and diamond earrings that once belonged to Princess Diana. She felt the weight of history on her shoulders, but also the warmth of being part of something bigger than herself. In another room, Prince William checked his ceremonial uniform one last time. The dark blue fabric was adorned with medals and honors that represented his years of service to the nation. His aide stood nearby, ready to assist with any last-minute details. William's mind wandered to his children, wondering how they would handle the enormous attention they were about to receive. He had tried to prepare them, telling them stories about his own childhood experiences with royal events, but he knew that nothing could truly prepare someone for the magnitude of a coronation. Down the hallway, 9-year-old Prince George sat quietly on his bed, dressed in a miniature version of his father's ceremonial attire. His younger sister, Princess Charlotte, kept peeking into his room, her excitement barely contained. She wore a beautiful white dress with a delicate tiara that sparkled when it caught the light. Charlotte had been practicing her wave for weeks, determined to get it just right for the crowds. Their youngest brother, Prince Louis, was having a harder time staying still. At 5 years old, the formality of the day felt overwhelming, and he kept tugging at his collar, asking his nanny when they could finally leave. The family gathered in the main drawing room, and for a moment the formal atmosphere melted away. Kate knelt down to adjust Louis's tie while Charlotte showed her mother the new shoes she was wearing. William placed a reassuring hand on George's shoulder, giving him a nod that said everything would be all right. The children had been briefed about the day's schedule multiple times, but Kate went over it once more, her voice gentle and encouraging. They would ride in a carriage through the streets of London, wave to the people, and then participate in the ceremony at Westminster Abbey. After that, there would be a balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace where the entire nation would be watching. Outside, the royal carriages waited, their gold and glass surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. The horses were perfectly groomed, their manes braided with precision. Security personnel moved with practiced efficiency, checking every detail one final time. The route to Westminster Abbey had been cleared, and barriers held back the growing crowds of well-wishers who had traveled from all corners of the United Kingdom and beyond. As the family prepared to leave, Kate took a deep breath and looked at her children. George stood tall, trying to embody the responsibility he would one day inherit. Charlotte's eyes sparkled with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Louis fidgeted but managed a brave smile when his mother caught his eye. William squeezed Kate's hand, a silent gesture of support and partnership that had carried them through years of public life together. The double doors opened, and they stepped out into the morning air. The sound of cheering immediately filled their ears, even though they were still within the palace grounds. Cameras flashed from designated press areas, capturing every moment for history. The family moved toward their carriage with practiced grace, each step measured and deliberate. Palace staff bowed as they passed, their faces showing pride in serving the royal household. Prince George climbed into the carriage first, followed by his siblings. William helped each child settle into their seats before assisting Kate. The interior of the carriage was plush and comfortable, but the real spectacle was visible through the large glass windows. As they began their journey, the roar of the crowd grew louder. Thousands upon thousands of people waved British flags, their voices joining together in celebration. Charlotte pressed her face close to the window, her wave already in full motion. Louis copied his sister, though his movements were less refined and more enthusiastic. George sat with remarkable composure for someone his age, understanding that cameras were tracking his every move. Kate and William exchanged glances, both proud of how their children were handling the pressure. The carriage rolled slowly through the streets, allowing everyone a chance to see the royal family. Some people in the crowd had tears streaming down their faces, moved by the historic significance of the moment. Others jumped and cheered, their excitement infectious. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, waving homemade signs and banners. One elderly woman clutched a photograph of Queen Elizabeth, holding it up as the carriage passed, her way of honoring the continuity of the monarchy. As they moved through different neighborhoods, the diversity of London became apparent. People from all backgrounds, religions, and cultures had come together to witness this moment. Street vendors sold commemorative items, from flags to mugs bearing the royal family's image. Musicians played patriotic songs, and the atmosphere felt like a massive celebration that united everyone present. Inside the carriage, Kate pointed out interesting signs and faces to the children, helping them stay engaged with the crowd. William nodded and smiled at familiar faces among the dignitaries and officials stationed along the route. The journey to Westminster Abbey was taking longer than usual, deliberately slowed to allow maximum visibility for those who had waited so long. The ancient abbey came into view, its Gothic architecture standing as a testament to faith and tradition. Kings and queens had been crowned there for nearly 1,000 years, and today would add another chapter to that legacy. The crowds grew even denser near the abbey, with special viewing stands erected for invited guests and foreign dignitaries. Security was at its highest here, with every person screened and every bag checked. As the carriage approached the final stretch, Kate could feel her heartbeat quickening. This was the moment they had been preparing for, when they would step out before the world and take their place in a ceremony that would be remembered for generations. She looked at her children once more, seeing courage in their young faces, and felt a surge of maternal pride that momentarily overwhelmed her royal composure. The carriage came to a graceful stop at the entrance of Westminster Abbey, and the noise from the crowd seemed to pause for just a moment, as if the entire world was holding its breath. William stepped out first, his military uniform catching the sunlight. He turned immediately to help Kate, offering his hand with the same gentleness he had shown on their wedding day years ago. Her ivory gown flowed elegantly as she descended, and the crowd erupted into applause that echoed off the surrounding buildings. One by one, the children emerged from the carriage. Prince George stepped out with careful deliberation, his young face serious but calm. He had been told many times that cameras would capture every expression, every movement, and he was determined to represent his family well. Princess Charlotte followed, and the moment her feet touched the ground, she offered the crowd a smile that lit up her entire face. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People cheered louder, and someone in the distance shouted words of encouragement that were lost in the general roar but felt by everyone present. Prince Louis came last, and his exit was less smooth than his siblings. He stumbled slightly on the carriage step, caught himself, and then looked around with wide eyes at the massive gathering. For a 5-year-old, the scene must have been both thrilling and terrifying. Kate immediately reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze that seemed to restore his confidence. He straightened his small jacket and walked forward with renewed determination. The family formed a line at the Abbey entrance, and palace officials rushed forward to make final adjustments. A lady-in-waiting smoothed Charlotte's dress while another attendant checked that George's medals were perfectly aligned. Kate's long train was arranged behind her, the fabric spreading across the ancient stones like a river of silk. William stood at the front, his posture military straight, his expression one of focused readiness. Before them, the massive wooden doors of Westminster Abbey stood open, revealing a glimpse of the grandeur inside. The interior was illuminated by thousands of candles and modern lighting that highlighted the building's architectural magnificence. Centuries of history lived in those walls, and every person entering felt the weight of that legacy. The scent of flowers and incense drifted out from within, mixing with the fresh outdoor air. The royal party began their procession into the Abbey, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Outside had been loud and chaotic with celebration, but inside was hushed and reverent. Rows of distinguished guests rose to their feet as the family passed. Foreign royalty, heads of state, religious leaders, and representatives from every corner of the Commonwealth filled the pews. Each person had been carefully selected and invited, their presence marking the international significance of the occasion. Charlotte's eyes widened as she took in the scene. The abbey's vaulted ceilings seemed to stretch endlessly upward, decorated with banners and heraldic symbols. Stained glass windows filtered colored light across the stone floor, creating patterns that danced and shifted. A choir, positioned in the upper gallery, sang in perfect harmony, their voices filling the sacred space with music that seemed to come from heaven itself. George walked with measured steps, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He had been coached on where to look, how to walk, and when to bow, but the reality of the moment was far more intense than any rehearsal. His great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had walked this same path decades ago, and his grandfather had done so more recently. Now it was his generation's turn to carry the tradition forward, and the responsibility felt enormous on his young shoulders. Louis, holding tightly to his mother's hand, kept glancing upward at the high ceilings and the elaborate decorations. At one point he tugged on Kate's sleeve and whispered something that made her smile, though she gently reminded him to stay focused. The processional music swelled around them, played by an orchestra that had been practicing for months to ensure perfection on this day. As they moved deeper into the abbey, familiar faces appeared among the guests. Kate's parents sat with expressions of pride mixed with emotion, watching their daughter participate in an event of such historical magnitude. William's aunts and uncles occupied places of honor, their own experiences with royal ceremonies evident in their composed demeanors. Friends from the couple's university days sat alongside military, colleagues and representatives from the various charities the family supported. The procession reached the central area where the main ceremony would take place. Here, elaborate chairs had been positioned, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The coronation chair used for centuries sat prominently, its ancient wood bearing the marks of age and countless ceremonies. Nearby, smaller thrones had been arranged for other members of the royal family, their placement carefully considered according to protocol and tradition. Religious officials stood ready in their ceremonial robes, their faces solemn and prepared. The archbishop held a large Bible, its pages marked with ribbons indicating the readings that would be performed. Beside him, other clergy members held items that would be used in various parts of the ceremony, each object heavy with symbolism and meaning accumulated over generations. The family took their designated positions, and for a moment there was complete silence in the abbey. Then the archbishop's voice rang out, beginning the ancient words that had opened coronation ceremonies for nearly a millennium. His words echoed off the stone walls, carried by excellent acoustics to every corner of the building. Outside, through speakers set up along the procession route, those same words reached the thousands still gathered in the streets. Charlotte sat very still, her hands folded in her lap exactly as her mother had taught her. She watched everything with intense curiosity, her young mind absorbing details that she would remember for the rest of her life. Louis was less successful at staying still, his feet swinging slightly under his chair, but he remained quiet and mostly focused on what was happening around him. The ceremony proceeded with clockwork precision, each element following the next according to plans that had been refined over months of preparation. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered, and oaths were taken. Each word, each gesture carried layers of meaning that connected the present moment to centuries of British history. The watching world saw not just a family, but the continuation of an institution that had shaped nations and influenced the course of human events. Kate's mind wandered briefly to her own journey. From a girl growing up in Berkshire to standing in Westminster Abbey as a central figure in a royal coronation, she thought about the challenges she had faced, the criticism she had endured, and the growth she had experienced. Looking at her children, she felt a fierce determination to prepare them for their own journeys, to give them the tools they would need to navigate the unique path that lay before them. William's thoughts were similarly reflective. He remembered his mother, Princess Diana, and wished she could have been there to see her grandchildren, to witness how Kate had embraced the role that had once seemed so daunting. He thought about his father and the long years of preparation that preceded this moment. Most of all, he thought about the future, about the monarchy his children would inherit, and his responsibility to ensure it remained relevant and meaningful in a rapidly changing world. The ceremony continued, building toward its climactic moments, each second bringing them closer to the point when everything would change, when new responsibilities would be formally acknowledged. and when the family would step fully into roles that would define the rest of their lives. The ceremony reached its most sacred moments, and even young Louis seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. The abbey, already quiet, became almost impossibly still. Every eye focused on the central platform where ancient rituals were being performed, with the same careful attention to detail that had been maintained for generations. The archbishop's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he spoke words that had been said before kings and queens throughout history. Kate watched as various ceremonial objects were presented, each one representing different aspects of sovereignty and service. There was the orb, symbolizing Christian authority over the world, the scepter representing temporal power and justice, the sword standing for protection of the realm. Each item was lifted high for all to see before being carefully placed in its designated position. The symbolism was lost on Louis, who was more interested in the sparkle of the jewels, but George understood the significance, his young face showing concentration as he tried to absorb everything. Charlotte noticed the elaborate embroidery on the ceremonial robes worn by the clergy. As someone who loved art and crafts, she was fascinated by the intricate needlework that must have taken countless hours to complete. She leaned slightly toward her mother and whispered a question about the golden threads. Kate smiled softly and promised to explain everything later, gently redirecting her daughter's attention back to the ceremony. The music swelled again, this time with a piece composed specifically for this occasion. The combination of organ, orchestra, and choir created a sound so powerful and moving that many guests found tears forming in their eyes. The acoustics of Westminster Abbey amplified every note, filling the space with music that seemed to transcend the earthly and touch something divine. Outside, people listening through speakers stood motionless, drawn into the moment despite not being able to see what was happening inside. William felt the full weight of the crown, both literally and figuratively, as he watched the ceremony unfold. He thought about the promises being made, the oaths being taken, and what they meant for his family's future. His military training had taught him about duty and service, but this was different. This was about carrying forward a legacy that stretched back more than 1,000 years. About being a symbol for millions of people who looked to the royal family for stability and continuity in an uncertain world. The ceremony included moments where traditional texts were read, some in English and some in Latin, connecting the present to medieval practices. These ancient words spoke of divine right, of responsibility to God and country, of the solemn trust placed in those who wore the crown. Kate found herself deeply moved by the language, even though some of it was difficult to understand. The emotion behind the words transcended mere comprehension. Prince George had been given a specific role in part of the ceremony, a small but significant participation that acknowledged his position as second in line to the throne. When his moment came, he rose from his seat with careful precision and walked to where he was needed. His movements were steady despite the millions of eyes watching around the world. He performed his duty exactly as rehearsed, his voice clear when he needed to speak, his gestures appropriate and measured. When he returned to his seat, William gave him the smallest nod of approval, and George allowed himself a tiny smile of relief. The congregation participated in various responses throughout the ceremony, their collective voices creating a powerful chorus of affirmation. Foreign dignitaries, some from countries with their own monarchies and some from republics, witnessed these traditions with varying degrees of familiarity. For some, it was a glimpse into practices their own nations had abandoned centuries ago. For others, it was a reminder of similar ceremonies in their own countries. All recognized the historical significance of what they were observing. Kate's parents watched with emotions that were impossible to fully express. They had raised their daughter in a comfortable but decidedly non-royal environment, never imagining that one day she would be standing in Westminster Abbey as a central figure in a coronation. Her father's eyes glistened with tears he was too proud to wipe away. Her mother clutched her handkerchief tightly, overcome by the magnitude of the moment and the grace with which her daughter was handling it all. The ceremony included prayers for the nation, for the Commonwealth, for peace in the world, and for wisdom for those in positions of leadership. These prayers were offered by religious leaders from different faiths, reflecting the diversity of modern Britain. Each leader brought their own tradition's perspective, creating a tapestry of spiritual support that encompassed various beliefs while maintaining respect for the Church of England's special role in the monarchy. As the ceremony progressed toward its conclusion, the mood in the abbey began to shift slightly. The most solemn portions were complete, and what remained were the celebratory elements that would transition from sacred ritual to national celebration. The choir prepared for the final hymns, their voices already legendary but about to deliver performances that would be remembered and replayed for decades to come. Louis, who had been remarkably patient for a 5-year-old, was starting to show signs of restlessness. He shifted in his seat and yawned, not quite managing to cover his mouth in time. A photographer caught the moment, and the image would later become one of the most shared photos of the day, endearing the young prince to people around the world who remembered what it was like to be a child, forced to sit still through long, incomprehensible events. Charlotte remained more composed. Though she too was ready for the ceremony to conclude, she had practiced sitting still for long periods in preparation for this day, and her determination to do everything perfectly kept her focused even as her legs grew tired and her back began to ache from maintaining proper posture. The final blessing was pronounced, the Archbishop's words carrying hope and benediction for the future. The congregation responded with a resounding amen that seemed to shake the ancient walls. Then gradually the formal ceremony began to wind down. Though the day was far from over, the family would need to process back out of the abbey, return to their carriage, and make their way to Buckingham Palace for the next phase of celebrations. As they prepared to leave, Kate took a moment to straighten her children's clothing once more. George's jacket had shifted slightly during the ceremony. Charlotte's tiara needed a minor adjustment. Louis's tie was loosened. These small maternal gestures performed in the midst of such grandeur reminded everyone watching that despite the crowns and ceremonies, they were still a family caring for each other. William exchanged words with several officials, confirming the next steps in the day's schedule. Everything was running according to plan, but the coordination required to manage such a complex event meant constant communication between various teams. Security personnel positioned themselves for the exit procession. Camera crews prepared to capture the family's departure. Outside, the crowds had grown even larger, if such a thing was possible, as people who had been elsewhere in London made their way to the route back to the palace. The family formed up for their exit procession, and the Abbey's great organ began to play a triumphant recessional piece. As they began to move back down the long aisle, guests again rose to their feet, many applauding despite the sacred setting. The children walked with visible relief that the longest and most formal part of the day was behind them. The bright daylight visible through the Abbey's entrance promised a return to the outdoor world and the cheering crowds that had greeted them earlier. They stepped out into the sunshine once more, and the roar of the crowd was deafening, a wave of sound that seemed to physically push against them. The carriage awaited, ready to carry them on the next leg of their journey through history. The transition from the solemn atmosphere of Westminster Abbey to the jubilant energy of the streets created a striking contrast that took a moment to adjust to. The family climbed back into their carriage, and immediately the children's spirits lifted. Louis bounced slightly in his seat, his earlier restlessness now transformed into excitement about the ride back to Buckingham Palace. Charlotte smoothed her dress carefully, wanting to look perfect for the crowds they would pass. George allowed himself to relax just a little, though he remained conscious of his visibility through the carriage windows. The procession began its journey through central London, taking a longer route than necessary to allow more people the opportunity to see the royal family. The streets had been transformed since their earlier passage. Now every available space seemed occupied by someone waving a flag, holding a sign, or simply cheering with unrestrained enthusiasm. Buildings were decorated with banners and bunting in red, white, and blue. Some shop windows featured elaborate displays celebrating the coronation, their creativity ranging from traditional to wildly modern. Kate pointed out various sights to the children as they passed, helping them stay engaged with the crowds. She knew from experience how overwhelming these events could be, how the faces and voices could blur together into a meaningless mass if you did not make an effort to connect with individual people. She taught her children to look for specific faces, to make eye contact when possible, to wave directly at someone rather than just generally at the crowd. William watched his family interact with the public and felt a deep sense of pride. This was what the monarchy meant in the modern age. This connection between the institution and the people, not the crowns or ceremonies, important as those were for continuity and tradition. But these moments of human connection, when ordinary citizens felt seen and acknowledged by their royal family. He waved to a group of veterans standing with military precision despite their advanced years, their chests bearing medals from conflicts long past. The carriage passed through Trafalgar Square, where the crowds were particularly dense. Someone had released red, white, and blue balloons that drifted upward into the afternoon sky. Children perched on the famous lion statues waved frantically, hoping to catch the attention of the young princes and princess. Street performers had paused their usual activities to join in the celebration, their colorful costumes adding to the festive atmosphere. Charlotte spotted a girl about her own age holding a homemade sign with her name on it, decorated with drawings of flowers and crowns. She waved enthusiastically at the girl, who burst into tears of joy at being noticed. The girl's mother hugged her daughter tightly, and both were clearly overcome with emotion. Charlotte turned to her mother with a delighted smile, thrilled that her small gesture had created such a reaction. Louis became fascinated by a marching band that had positioned itself along the route. The musicians played patriotic tunes with infectious energy, their brass instruments gleaming in the sunlight. Louis mimicked playing a trumpet, making his siblings laugh. Even in the midst of such a formal occasion, moments of ordinary childhood joy broke through, reminding everyone that behind the titles and duties were real children, experiencing their own unique adventure. The procession route took them past historic landmarks that held special significance for the royal family. They passed buildings where famous events in British history had occurred, monuments to past monarchs and heroes, and institutions that had served the nation for centuries. Each location added layers of meaning to the journey, connecting the present moment to the long thread of history that had led to this day. Foreign tourists mixed with British citizens in the crowds, many having planned their visit specifically to coincide with the coronation. Some had traveled from Commonwealth countries feeling a personal connection to the British monarchy through their own nation's histories. Others came from places with no such ties but were drawn by the spectacle and pageantry of a tradition that had largely vanished from the modern world. The carriage approached the Mall, the wide ceremonial avenue leading directly to Buckingham Palace. Here the crowds reached their peak density, with people packed shoulder to shoulder as far as the eye could see. Union Jack flags created a sea of color, waving in rhythm like a living organism. The noise was incredible, a sustained roar of celebration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Kate felt her emotions rising as they neared the palace. This building, which had become so familiar to her over the years, now represented something even more significant. It was not just a residence or an office, but a symbol recognized around the world, a focal point for national unity and celebration. The balcony appearance that awaited them would be watched by billions, a moment frozen in time that would be analyzed and remembered for generations. The palace gates came into view, their golden details shining brilliantly in the afternoon light. The Victoria Memorial stood before them, its marble surfaces reflecting the sunshine. Guards in their distinctive uniforms maintained their posts with unwavering discipline, despite the chaos of celebration surrounding them. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed, every person in their designated position, all working together to create a flawless experience. As the carriage passed through the palace gates, the sound of the crowd changed but did not diminish. Those gathered in front of the palace had been waiting there all day, many having arrived before dawn to secure the best viewing positions. They pressed against the barriers, hoping for the best possible view of the balcony where the royal family would soon appear. The carriage came to a stop in the palace courtyard, away from public view. Staff members immediately surrounded the vehicle, ready to assist the family. The children were helped down first, each one looking slightly overwhelmed by everything they had experienced. Palace officials ushered them toward a private entrance, where they could have a brief respite before the next public appearance. Inside the palace, the family was led to a private room where they could refresh themselves and prepare for the balcony appearance. Kate checked her makeup, which had held up remarkably well despite the long day. William removed his ceremonial hat and ran a hand through his hair, grateful for a moment of relative normalcy. The children were given drinks and small snacks, something to revive their energy for what was to come. Through the palace windows, they could see the massive crowd gathered on the Mall. The sight was both humbling and energizing. All those people had come to celebrate, to be part of history, to show their support for the monarchy and what it represented. The family had a responsibility to those people, to give them a moment they would treasure, to make their long wait worthwhile. A palace official entered to brief them on the balcony appearance timing. Everything was coordinated with precision, from when they would step out to how long they would remain visible. The Royal Air Force flypast had been scheduled, weather permitting, and would provide a spectacular conclusion to the public celebrations. The family listened to the instructions, each member preparing themselves mentally for the final public appearance of the day. George straightened his uniform again, his young face showing determination. Charlotte practiced her wave one more time, wanting it to be perfect. Louis, despite his earlier restlessness during the ceremony, seemed to have found a second wind of energy, bouncing slightly on his toes with excitement. Kate and William exchanged a look that communicated everything they were feeling, pride and nervousness and joy and responsibility all mixed together. The moment approached when they would step onto that famous balcony, when the crowd's anticipation would finally be satisfied, when the day's celebrations would reach their climactic moment. The palace staff made final checks and adjustments, ensuring every detail was perfect. The family moved toward the balcony doors, their footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor, while outside thousands of voices raised in anticipation of their appearance. The balcony doors remained closed, but through them, the muffled roar of the crowd created a constant reminder of what awaited. William stood closest to the doors, his hand resting protectively on George's shoulder. The young prince looked up at his father, seeking reassurance, and received it in the form of a confident smile. Kate adjusted Charlotte's tiara one final time, more out of nervous habit than necessity, as it was already perfectly positioned. Louis hopped from foot to foot, his energy seemingly inexhaustible despite the long day. A palace official counted down with raised fingers, signaling the final seconds before their appearance. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The doors swung open, and the family stepped out onto the most famous balcony in the world. The roar that greeted them was unlike anything the children had ever experienced. It was a physical force, a wall of sound so powerful it seemed to vibrate through their bodies. Thousands upon thousands of faces looked up at them, every single person cheering, waving, celebrating with unbridled enthusiasm. William raised his hand in greeting, and the crowd's response somehow managed to grow even louder. Kate waved with the practiced grace she had perfected over years of public appearances, her smile genuine and warm despite the overwhelming attention. George stood very still for a moment, clearly processing the magnitude of what he was seeing, before beginning to wave with careful, measured movements. Charlotte needed no such adjustment period, her wave already in motion as she stepped onto the balcony, her face glowing with delight. Louis, true to his nature, approached the moment with less formality. He waved with both hands, bounced on his toes, and at one point pressed his face close to the balcony railing to look directly down at the people below. Kate gently pulled him back, laughing despite herself at his enthusiasm. The crowd loved it, finding his unfiltered joy refreshing amid all the ceremony and protocol. The Victoria Memorial below them was surrounded by a sea of people that extended as far as anyone could see down the mall. Flags created waves of color, moving in patterns as different sections of the crowd waved them in unison. Some people held phones and cameras aloft, desperate to capture the moment despite being so far away that the family would appear as little more than distant figures in their photos. It did not matter. They wanted proof they had been there, physical evidence of their participation in this historic day. Kate looked out at the crowd and felt overwhelmed by the trust and affection being directed toward her family. She thought about her journey to this moment, the decade and more of learning, adapting, and growing into her role. There had been difficult times, moments when the criticism felt overwhelming, periods when she questioned whether she was truly suited for this life. But standing there with her children beside her and thousands of people celebrating below, she felt a deep sense of purpose and belonging. William scanned the crowd, trying to take in details despite the overwhelming scope of what he was seeing. He noticed elderly people who had likely attended his grandmother's coronation decades ago, now witnessing another chapter in the story they had followed their entire lives. He saw young families with children who were learning about royal traditions for the first time. He spotted groups of friends who had made a day of it, dressed in patriotic clothing and carrying elaborate signs. The moment came when the Royal Air Force flypast would occur. Weather conditions having been deemed acceptable, palace officials had timed everything perfectly, and right on schedule the sound of approaching aircraft could be heard over the crowd noise. Heads turned skyward in anticipation. George's eyes lit up with excitement. Like many boys his age, he was fascinated by planes and had been looking forward to this part of the day more than any other. The aircraft appeared, a formation of historic and modern planes, representing different eras of British aviation. They flew in perfect formation, their contrails creating lines across the sky. The lead aircraft came first, followed by others in a carefully choreographed display that had taken weeks to prepare. The noise of their engines temporarily drowned out even the crowd's cheering, creating a moment of pure sensory overload. Lewis pointed at the planes with both hands, jumping up and down with excitement. George watched with intense focus, identifying different aircraft types and clearly itching to discuss them with anyone who would listen. Charlotte's attention divided between the planes and the crowd's reaction to them, fascinated by both the spectacle above and the response below. The flypast culminated with the Red Arrows, the Royal Air Force's aerobatic team, trailing their signature red, white, and blue smoke. They executed a perfect flyover directly above Buckingham Palace, their colored trails creating a patriotic banner across the sky. The crowd went wild, the cheering reaching new heights. People hugged strangers beside them, overcome with emotion and excitement. Some wept openly, moved by the beauty and significance of the moment. As the planes disappeared into the distance and their engine noise faded, the family continued waving to the crowd. This balcony appearance was scheduled to last longer than usual, giving people the opportunity to truly experience the moment, rather than having it flash by in seconds. Kate made sure to wave to different sections of the crowd, not wanting anyone to feel ignored. William did the same, occasionally pointing out interesting things to the children. Charlotte noticed a group of children around her age who had dressed up as princes and princesses. Their homemade costumes elaborate and clearly prepared with great care. She gave them a special wave, delighted by their creativity. The children screamed with joy at being acknowledged. Holding their signs higher and jumping up and down, the minutes stretched on, and the family remained on the balcony, understanding that this moment belonged to the people as much as it belonged to them. The crowd showed no signs of tiring, their energy sustained by the historic nature of the day. Some people had been standing for more than 12 hours, but you would never know it from their enthusiasm. They had come to witness history, and they were determined to savor every second. George leaned toward his father and said something that made William smile. Whatever the young prince had observed or commented on clearly struck his father as insightful or amusing. William responded, and for a moment they were just a father and son sharing a private conversation, despite being watched by billions. These small moments of genuine family interaction made the royal family feel more accessible and relatable to those watching. Kate bent down to speak with Louis, who was starting to show signs that his energy was finally waning. The long day was catching up with him, and while he was still smiling and waving, his movements had lost some of their earlier enthusiasm. She spoke encouraging words to him, probably reminding him that they did not have much longer to go before they could retreat inside and truly relax. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mall, painting everything in golden light that photographers would later describe as perfect. The timing of the balcony appearance had been carefully calculated to take advantage of this lighting, ensuring the images captured would be as beautiful as possible. Every photograph taken in those moments would become a potential keepsake, a memory frozen in time. Music began to play from speakers positioned around the palace grounds. The national anthem filled the air, and the entire crowd sang along with remarkable unity. Thousands of voices joined together, creating a moving display of patriotism and shared identity. The family stood at attention during the anthem, even the children understanding the solemnity of this particular moment. George sang along, his voice too quiet to be heard but his lips clearly forming the words he had learned long ago. When the anthem concluded, the applause that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. It went on, wave after wave of appreciation and celebration. The family waved with renewed energy, feeding off the crowd's enthusiasm. This was the magic of these moments, this exchange of energy between the royal family and the public, each side uplifting the other. Eventually, The time came for the family to withdraw. They could not remain on the balcony indefinitely, and palace officials had signaled that the scheduled appearance time had been reached. William gave one final wave, his gesture sweeping across the entire crowd. Kate did the same, her smile never wavering even as she prepared to step back inside. The children waved enthusiastically, clearly reluctant to leave despite their tiredness. As they turned to walk back through the balcony doors, Louis gave one last enthusiastic wave that was more of a full-body wiggle. The crowd roared its approval at his adorable farewell. Charlotte curtsied slightly, a gesture no one had told her to do, but that felt appropriate to her sense of occasion. George walked backward for a few steps, wanting to wave for as long as possible before the doors closed behind them. The moment the doors shut, cutting off the crowd noise, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The family was suddenly in the quiet, private world of the palace interior, away from the eyes and cameras. Louis immediately slumped against his mother, his exhaustion finally evident. Charlotte kicked off her shoes with a sigh of relief. George loosened his collar, grateful to relax the formal posture he had maintained all day. William and Kate exchanged a long look, one that communicated relief, pride, exhaustion, and satisfaction all at once. They had done it. The day they had prepared for so intensely was nearly complete. Their children had performed beautifully, handling pressures that would overwhelm most adults. The ceremonies had gone flawlessly, the crowds had been enthusiastic and supportive, and the weather had cooperated perfectly. Palace staff appeared with refreshments and comfortable chairs, understanding that the family needed a moment to decompress. Kate accepted a glass of water gratefully, realizing she had barely had anything to drink all day. William sat down heavily, the weight of his ceremonial uniform suddenly feeling much heavier than it had hours earlier. The children clustered around their parents, talking excitedly about everything they had seen and experienced. Outside, the crowd slowly began to disperse, though many people lingered, reluctant to let the day end. They took final photographs, purchased last-minute souvenirs from vendors, and shared their experiences with friends and family via phone calls and messages. The celebration would continue in pubs and homes across the country, with people discussing what they had witnessed and what it meant for the future. Television networks around the world were already beginning their analysis of the day's events, with commentators discussing everything from the ceremony's symbolism to the children's behavior to Kate's fashion choices. Social media exploded with posts, photos, and videos, each person who had attended or watched wanting to share their perspective on this historic occasion. Back in the palace, the family remained together, processing the day's experiences. They knew that official obligations would continue in the days and weeks ahead, but for now they had this moment of privacy and togetherness. The coronation was complete, the public appearances fulfilled, and they had successfully navigated one of the most important and challenging days of their lives. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and expectations, but tonight, they could simply be a family, exhausted but triumphant, having written their own chapter in the long story of the British monarchy. The evening descended over London, bringing with it a sense of peaceful conclusion to an extraordinary day. The palace staff worked efficiently to transform the formal reception areas into more comfortable spaces, where the family could finally relax without the pressure of cameras and public scrutiny. Kate changed out of her ceremonial gown into something far more practical and comfortable, feeling immediate relief as the heavy fabric and structured corseting gave way to soft, familiar clothing. The children were ushered to their rooms where nannies helped them out of their formal attire. George carefully hung his miniature uniform, treating it with the respect such a significant garment deserved. He knew it would be preserved, perhaps eventually displayed in a museum where future generations could see what he had worn on this momentous day. Charlotte examined her tiara one last time before it was carefully packed away, memorizing its sparkle and weight. Louis, completely exhausted, barely registered being changed into pajamas. His earlier boundless energy finally depleted. William found himself alone for a brief moment, standing at a palace window overlooking the now dark mall. Streetlights illuminated the avenue, showing the debris left behind by the massive crowds, evidence of the celebration that had taken place. Cleanup crews were already at work, but it would take hours to restore everything to normal. He thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, and wondered what she would have thought about the day's events. He liked to believe she would have been proud, would have approved of how the family had handled themselves. Dinner was a private affair. Just the immediate family gathered around a table in one of the palace's smaller dining rooms. The formal state banquet would come later in the week, but tonight was about family. Kate had requested simple food, knowing the children would be too tired to appreciate anything elaborate. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing observations about the day, but mostly just being together without the need for performance or protocol. George spoke thoughtfully about what he had observed during the ceremony, asking questions about the symbolism and history behind various elements. His intellectual curiosity had been awakened by the day's events, and William patiently answered each question, pleased that his son was engaging seriously with his future role. Charlotte talked about the beautiful dresses and decorations she had seen, already planning how she might incorporate some of those designs into her own artwork. Louis fell asleep at the table, his head drooping forward until Kate gently woke him enough to guide him to bed. After the children were tucked in, William and Kate finally had time alone together. They sat in a private sitting room, the television playing news coverage of the day with the sound muted. Images flashed across the screen showing various moments from the coronation, the procession, and the balcony appearance. Kate watched herself wave to crowds, feeling strange about seeing her own image replayed on television. William pointed out moments he had not fully processed in real time, things that had happened while his attention was elsewhere. They talked about how well the children had done, expressing pride in George's composure, Charlotte's enthusiasm, and even Louis's occasional lapses in protocol that had humanized the entire event. They discussed the crowds, the ceremony, and the weight of what the day represented. This was more than just another royal event. It was a transition point, a moment when their lives shifted into a new phase with different expectations and responsibilities. Kate shared her nervousness about some of the upcoming obligations, the state visits and official duties that would now consume more of their schedule. William reassured her, reminding her of how much she had already grown in her role, how the public had truly embraced her. He pointed out that the crowds had cheered for her just as loudly as for anyone else, that she had earned her place not through birth but through dedication and genuine care for the work. The palace slowly quieted as staff completed their duties and retired for the night. Security personnel maintained their vigilant watch, but even they seemed to move more quietly, respecting the exhaustion that permeated the building. Outside, London continued its own celebrations in pubs and private homes. But inside Buckingham Palace, the royal family sought rest after one of the most demanding days any of them had ever experienced. William checked on the children before retiring to his own room. George was fast asleep, his face peaceful and young in the dim light from the hallway. Charlotte had arranged her stuffed animals in what looked like a recreation of the balcony scene, a creative interpretation of what she had experienced. Louis was sprawled across his bed in complete abandon, snoring softly, having pushed all his covers onto the floor. In their private bedroom, Kate sat at her dressing table, removing the last traces of the elaborate makeup that had been applied so many hours ago. She looked at her reflection, seeing a woman who had survived what she had once feared might be too much to handle. The girl from Berkshire who had fallen in love with a prince had become a princess, and now stood on the threshold of even greater responsibilities. She felt ready for whatever came next. William joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they both looked at their reflection in the mirror. They had been through so much together, had faced criticism and praise, had raised children in the most unusual circumstances imaginable, and had done it all while the world watched. This day had been another milestone in their journey, and they had faced it together as they faced everything, as partners. The next morning would bring newspapers filled with analysis and photographs, social media reactions from around the world, and the beginning of adjusting to their new roles in the wake of the coronation. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, they were simply William and Kate, a couple grateful to have each other and proud of the family they had built together. Sleep came easier than expected, their exhaustion overriding any lingering excitement or anxiety about what tomorrow might bring. The coronation was complete, the public duties fulfilled, and they had emerged stronger and more confident. Their children had proven themselves capable of handling the enormous pressures placed upon them, showing maturity beyond their years while still maintaining the genuine joy and curiosity of childhood. The day had been everything it needed to be. a celebration of tradition and continuity, a display of national unity and pride, and most importantly, a family moment shared with millions. The images captured would become iconic, studied by historians and cherished by the public. The memory of that day would shape how the children understood their own roles and responsibilities as they grew older. As the palace fell into complete silence, with only the distant sounds of London's nighttime rhythms audible, the royal family rested. They had written their chapter in British history, had stood before the world with grace and dignity, and had shown that even in the modern age, ancient traditions could still unite and inspire. The coronation was over, but its impact would resonate for decades to come. A bright memory of a day when everything came together perfectly, when a family fulfilled its duty while remaining authentically themselves, and when the bond between the monarchy and the people felt stronger than ever before.